It begins with silence. Not the kind of silence you find in a quiet room or a hushed library, but the vast, echoing silence of the high mountains, the kind that presses against your skin and lingers in your ears. In that silence, a boy's voice was lost. A boy named Garrett Bardsley, just 12 years old, would vanish into the rugged wilderness of Utah in the summer of 2004. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't the kind of kid to wander off without reason. Garrett was a Boy Scout, raised in a family that valued responsibility, faith, and the great outdoors. He had hiked before. He had camped before. He was part of a tradition that had sent generations of young men into the wild to learn self-reliance and teamwork. But on that August morning, something shifted, a moment so ordinary, so seemingly harmless, it could have happened to anyone. A quick walk back to camp, just a few hundred yards away, shoes wet from the cold mountain water, clothes damp from a fishing trip with his father, a short trek, a direct path, and then nothing, no scream, no sign of struggle, no trail to follow. One moment, Garrett was there, laughing with his dad, preparing to return to the safety of camp. The next, he was gone. To understand why his disappearance still haunts Utah to this day, you need to know who Garrett was. He was born into a large, close-knit family in Elk Ridge, Utah. Garrett was one of 7 children, a boy who carried with him the lively energy of a big household. His parents, Kevin and Tamara Bardsley, were devoted to raising their children with strong values, built around family unity, faith, and resilience. Garrett, by all accounts, was outgoing and full of humor. He had a spark that drew others to him, the kind of boy who could make his siblings laugh at the dinner table or keep spirits high on a long hike. But Garrett wasn't just playful. He was dependable, the kind of kid who embraced the structure of Boy Scouts. He loved the outdoors, and in 2004, he was attending a backpacking trip in the Uinta Mountains with his father and his scout troop. For many families in Utah, Boy Scouts was more than just an extracurricular activity. It was almost a rite of passage. Trips into the mountains were both adventure and tradition, a way to shape boys into capable young men. That summer, Garrett's troop was camping near Q Brant Lake, a remote and strikingly beautiful spot in the high Uinta wilderness. The Uintas are unlike most other mountain ranges in the United States. Instead of running north to south like the Rockies, they stretch east to west, their ridgelines cutting across the Utah sky like jagged waves. At over 10,000 feet in elevation, Q Brant Lake sits nestled in thick forests of lodgepole pine, surrounded by rocky terrain, boulder fields, and narrow game trails. It is a place both breathtaking and unforgiving, where weather can turn suddenly, where the air is thin, and where the line between beauty and danger is razor-sharp. The Bardsleys knew the wilderness. They respected it. Garrett was not dropped into the mountains unprepared. He was in the company of his father, his scout leaders, and friends. But in the wilderness, sometimes preparation is not enough. Sometimes the smallest decision, the smallest moment of separation, changes everything. The morning of August 20th, 2004, began like many Boy Scout mornings do, early, crisp, and full of excitement. Garrett and his father rose before most of the others to go fishing in one of the nearby lakes. The air was cool, damp with mountain dew, and the scent of pine needles hung thick. The two of them walked together, father and son, carrying rods and tackle. They spent those quiet moments together as the sun lifted over the ridges, watching ripples on the lake, waiting for the tug of trout on the line. For Kevin Bardsley, it must have felt like one of those perfect father-son memories. Out there, away from the noise of everyday life, he had his boy at his side. They talked, they fished, they laughed. But after a while, Garrett slipped on some wet rocks near the edge of the water. His shoes soaked through, his socks drenched. Anyone who has hiked in the mountains knows the discomfort. Wet shoes mean cold feet, and cold feet can mean blisters or worse. Garrett's father told him to walk back to camp, change into dry shoes and socks, and then return. It was a simple instruction, a matter of comfort and safety. Camp wasn't far, maybe just a short walk away, through a stretch of forest and meadow. The trail wasn't complicated. Garrett knew the area, at least as much as any boy his age would. He had been moving between camp and the lakes with his troop. To everyone there that morning, it seemed like the kind of errand a boy his age could handle. Kevin watched as his son started back. He expected to see him again in just a few minutes, dry shoes on his feet, ready to fish once more. But Garrett never arrived. The weight of this moment is hard to capture. Imagine the trust between a father and son, the ordinary rhythm of a camping trip, the certainty that when you send your child a few hundred yards up a trail, they will appear at the other end. Parents make these small choices all the time. Run back to the car, head to the cabin. Walk back to the tent. They are part of the fabric of family life. But in this case, something broke in that fabric. Something inexplicable happened between the lake and the camp. When Kevin realized Garrett hadn't returned, he retraced the path. He called his son's name. He checked the camp, expecting to see him already there, maybe sitting with friends or changing his socks. But Garrett wasn't there. Scouts hadn't seen him. No one had. At first, the concern was mild. Maybe he'd gotten delayed, maybe he'd taken the wrong turn, and would be back any moment. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the atmosphere shifted. The mild concern hardened into dread. The Boy Scouts, trained in discipline and teamwork, began to fan out. Leaders called Garrett's name into the trees, their voices echoing through the pines. Kevin's heart pounded as the forest swallowed his calls. There was no answer. The story of Garrett Bardsley's disappearance begins here, in that terrible gap between expectation and reality. In those endless minutes when a father waits for his son to return, and he doesn't. That morning in the Uintas, the wilderness seemed unchanged. The pines stood tall. The lake shimmered. The sun rose higher in the sky. But in the space of a single walk back to camp, a 12-year-old boy had disappeared, leaving behind only silence. And that silence would soon grow louder than anyone could imagine. If you're drawn in by mysteries like this, make sure you subscribe right now. Every week, we dive into the disappearances and dark secrets most people never hear about. The Uinta Mountains are the kind of place that humbles you. They don't bow to human presence. They don't welcome visitors with gentle trails or forgiving terrain. At over 10,000 feet above sea level, the air is thin, the weather mercurial, and the land carved in ways that swallow sound and confuse the senses. For families in Utah, though, the Uintas have always been a destination. They're rugged, yes, but also breathtaking. Dozens of alpine lakes scatter across the basins, glacial blue against the dark green of lodgepole pines. Meadows burst with wildflowers in the summer. Elk and moose graze in the distance. On a clear day, you can look out over ridgelines that seem to stretch forever, rolling east or west in defiance of the north-south flow of most mountain ranges in America. To stand in the Uintas is to feel small, and yet, for generations, it's been the training ground for Boy Scouts, backpackers, and families seeking both adventure and solitude. It was into this wilderness that Garrett Bardsley and his troop set out in August 2004. For the boys, it was a trip laced with excitement. Nights under canvas tents, the smell of campfire smoke, and the thrill of fishing for trout in lakes so cold and clear you could see the bottom. For parents like Kevin Bardsley, it was a chance to pass down traditions. The quiet mornings on the water, the responsibility of carrying packs and cooking meals, the lessons of survival and teamwork. The troop made camp near Q Brant Lake, a high-altitude jewel tucked away in the forest. The name itself hints at its remoteness. Q Brant isn't a lake you stumble upon. You have to want to get there. The hike into the area requires effort, and once you arrive, you are isolated. No cell towers, no easy access roads, no quick way back to safety. But to the scouts, that isolation was part of the magic. Out there, away from television, phones, and suburban distractions, the boys could learn how to build fires, tie knots, and fish for their dinner. It was a kind of environment meant to shape character, but it was also a place where mistakes carried consequences. The Uintas, for all their beauty, can be brutally deceptive. Trails twist and braid through forest, fading into game paths used by elk and deer. Meadows open into boggy marshland, where footprints vanish. Rock slides create fields of talus where a misstep can send a hiker tumbling. The weather, too, is its own adversary. Clear skies can shift to hail and lightning storms in less than an hour. Temperatures can drop suddenly, especially at night, when the alpine air chills to near freezing even in summer. For children, the dangers multiply. Their stride is shorter, their sense of direction less refined, their tolerance for cold weaker. Even a short separation can spiral quickly into disorientation. In the wilderness, a single wrong turn can place you on a parallel trail, one that looks familiar but leads you deeper into nowhere. Once panic sets in, decisions become frantic rather than careful, and each step compounds a mistake. Search and rescue experts have documented this pattern for decades. A child who strays from camp often does not travel far, but they rarely stay still either. Fear pushes them forward. They may avoid calling out, convinced they are in trouble. They may hide from rescuers, mistaking strangers' voices for danger. And sometimes, the terrain hides them so well that even trained eyes pass within yards without ever seeing them. That morning at Q Brant Lake, these realities hung invisibly over the group. The boys were focused on fishing, hiking, and camp chores. The adults were focused on supervising, guiding, and making sure the trip remained safe. The lake glistened under a pale August sun, its edges lined with boulders slick from condensation. The forest beyond it stood dense. Pines packed shoulder to shoulder, their lower branches dark and tangled. When Garrett slipped on the wet rocks and soaked his shoes, it seemed like a small setback. He laughed it off. His father told him to go change, a decision that, in any other setting, would have been unremarkable. Walk back to camp, switch shoes, return. It was the kind of instruction fathers give their sons all the time in the outdoors. Practical, logical, but behind that practicality lurked the wilderness. Between the lake and the camp stretched a patchwork of meadows and trees where trails bled into one another. To an adult, the landmarks might have been obvious. A certain bend of the path, a cluster of boulders, the smell of campfire smoke rising faintly. To a 12-year-old, in wet socks, eager to hurry, those same features could blur together. It is in that blurred space between lake and camp, between safety and risk, that Garrett vanished. The wilderness was not new to Garrett. He was no stranger to camping. He had his father at his side. He had friends nearby. By every measure, he was not the archetype of a reckless, inexperienced hiker. And yet, even the most prepared families know that the wilderness doesn't discriminate. It does not spare the careful, the trained, or the innocent. In Utah, countless search and rescue teams can recall stories of hikers who were experienced, who carried maps, who knew the land, and still disappeared. In the Uintas, especially, there is a long history of people vanishing without trace. Some are found days later, dehydrated but alive. Others are discovered months or years later. Their remains stumbled upon by hunters or backpackers far from the original search zone. And some are never found at all. That knowledge, of course, came later. In the moment, as Garrett set off toward camp, no one watching him disappear down the trail would have imagined the tragedy about to unfold. His father expected to see him again in a few minutes. His troop expected to hear him laughing back at camp. The lake rippled behind him. The forest opened ahead of him, and the world seemed unchanged. But in wilderness stories, change is often invisible. A misstep, a wrong angle, a faint trail in the wrong direction. These small details stack together until the weight is unbearable. The silence of the Uintas can be deafening. Step too far from your group, and the sound of voices vanishes into the trees. Even 100 feet away, you can lose the thread of camp chatter. The pines absorb sound. The meadows carry it unevenly, and the rocks echo it back in misleading ways. Searchers have long noted how easy it is to call into the mountains and receive no reply. Or worse, hear your own voice bounce back, convincing you someone else is calling. When Garrett walked off that morning, this silence wrapped around him. It's possible he misjudged the trail. It's possible he rushed. It's possible he stopped to wring out his socks, only to look up and realize he no longer recognized the way. What we do know is simple. He never made it back to camp. That gap between the known and the unknown, the expected and the unimaginable, is where fear first began to bloom. The Uintas had claimed the attention of thousands of scouts over the years, but on August 20th, 2004, they would claim something else. A boy who was supposed to return in minutes instead became a name etched into Utah's wilderness tragedies. And as the minutes stretched on, his father's voice began to cut through the trees, calling into that silence, calling for a boy who would not answer. The wilderness had swallowed him whole. Every disappearance has a pivot point, a moment so ordinary, so seemingly harmless, that no one realizes until later it was a dividing line between safety and catastrophe. For Garrett Bardsley, that moment came not in the dead of night, not during a storm, not on some dangerous climb. It came in the stillness of morning, during a simple fishing trip with his father. The day was August 20th, 2004. The sun had only just begun to scatter light across the ridges of the Uinta Mountains, brushing the high pines with gold. Mist curled over the surface of the lake as Garrett and his father, Kevin Bardsley, cast their lines into the cold water. For the scouts, fishing was both pastime and challenge. The quiet patience of waiting, the thrill of feeling a tug, the pride of bringing a fish back to camp. Kevin must have felt proud. Here he was, with his son beside him, one of those moments fathers hope will last forever. No distractions, no schedules, just the two of them in the mountains, sharing laughter and small talk as trout rippled the surface. Garrett, at 12, was at that age between boyhood and adolescence. Old enough to take responsibility, young enough still to lean on his father's guidance. Then, in an instant so small it might have seemed irrelevant, Garrett slipped on the slick rocks near the water's edge. His feet splashed down, soaking his shoes and socks through. The mountain water was icy, frigid even in August, and within seconds, the discomfort set in. Kevin looked at his son and made a decision any parent might have made. Head back to camp and change. That was it. That was the moment. A few hundred yards. A path he knew. Camp visible or nearly so. Through the trees. By every calculation, this was a minor detour. Garrett would dry off, warm up, and return ready to fish again. Kevin stayed at the lake, confident he would see his boy walk back within minutes. But those minutes stretched into something else. At first, Kevin likely thought nothing of it. Boys linger. Maybe Garrett had stopped to talk to one of the other scouts. Maybe he got distracted, or maybe he was changing slower than expected. The lake was quiet. The forest hummed with the ordinary sounds of morning. Nothing in the air suggested danger. Still, as time went on, Kevin must have glanced up more often toward the trail. He probably scanned to the flicker of movement. A boy's silhouette, the sound of footsteps on pine needles. But the trail remained empty. No movement. No sound. He reeled in his line. He waited. He looked again. Nothing. That small seed of unease began to sprout. Fathers know their sons' habits, and Kevin knew Garrett wasn't careless. He wasn't a wanderer. If he'd been told to head to camp, he would have gone. So why wasn't he back? Kevin made the choice no parent ever forgets. He stood up, left the lake, and retraced the path toward camp. His eyes scanned the ground, the trees, the meadows in between. He called Garrett's name into the forest, his voice sharp, expectant. No answer. The trail between the lake and the camp was not long. Scouts had been walking it all morning, carrying rods and gear. It wasn't treacherous, not compared to the surrounding terrain. But it was enough. Enough for a wrong turn. Enough for disorientation. Enough for a boy in wet socks to drift just a few steps off the path and lose his bearings. By the time Kevin reached camp, his hope was still intact. Garrett would be there. He had to be. Maybe sitting on a log, tugging on dry socks. Maybe joking with one of his friends. Maybe already back in the tent. But when he arrived, the camp was absent of his son. The scouts shook their heads. No, they hadn't seen him. No, he hadn't come through. That's when Kevin's unease tipped into panic. Imagine that moment. Walking into camp, scanning faces, realizing the one you need is missing. Every parent's mind runs the same track. He has to be here. I must have just missed him. You check the tent. You check behind the logs. You ask again. You pace. The clock ticks. Your heartbeat rises. Kevin's voice grew sharper. He backtracked again, calling Garrett's name. Scouts joined in. At first, the search was casual, a widening circle, voices echoing, laughter still flickering in the air. But as those circles spread and no boy emerged, the atmosphere shifted. Scouts began moving faster. Adults exchanged worried looks. The name Garrett rang louder, more urgent, bouncing uselessly off the trees. Minutes turned to an hour. The sun climbed higher. What had begun as a fishing trip was unraveling into something unthinkable. This was the precise moment the balance tipped, from a simple walk back to camp into beginnings of a full-scale disappearance. And the details are what make it so chilling. Garrett wasn't lost in the middle of the night. He wasn't alone in some remote corner of the wilderness. He was surrounded by people, with his father nearby, with camp just a short walk away. The distance was measured not in miles, but in minutes. He wasn't injured, at least not that anyone saw. He wasn't running, hiding, or resisting. By all logic, Garrett should have been back in camp before his father even reeled in his fishing line. But he wasn't. And from that point forward, nothing, not Kevin's frantic calls, not the scouts' growing search, not the desperate retracing of steps, could bridge the gap between where Garrett was supposed to be and where he actually was. He had slipped away into that invisible crack between certainty and fear. There's a detail about wilderness disappearances that search and rescue experts often repeat. They happen quickly, quietly, and without warning. There is no cinematic vanishing, no sound of breaking branches or cries for help. More often than not, a child is simply gone, leaving behind only questions. That morning, Garrett joined that category of silence. The silence that devours footsteps. The silence that swallows names when they are shouted into the trees. The silence that turns a short walk into an endless mystery. Kevin couldn't have known it then, but the moment he told his son to walk back to camp would become the last time he saw Garrett. The story of what happened after, the scouts fanning out, the first ripples of panic, the calls for help would come next. But in this chapter of the story, everything freezes at the exact point where it all began. A father watching his son walk up the trail, expecting him to return, and realizing far too late that he never would. It is the most haunting part of Garrett's disappearance because it feels so preventable, so ordinary, so safe. The kind of instruction thousands of parents have given their children on camping trips without a second thought. Yet in the Uinta Mountains, even the ordinary can become fatal. Even a short walk can become a vanishing act. That morning at Q Brant Lake, Garrett didn't just walk back to camp. He walked into one of the most enduring mysteries Utah has ever known. Before we continue deeper into this chilling story, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These forgotten disappearances and unsolved mysteries deserve to be remembered. And by subscribing, you'll never miss the next case we uncover together. Now, let's return to the mountains, where the search for Garrett was only just beginning. The human mind has a strange way of processing fear. At first, it's logical, calm, almost convincing itself that everything is fine. He's just a little ahead. He took a wrong turn, but he'll show up in a minute. It reassures, rationalizes, softens a blow. But then there comes a tipping point, a moment when the rational voice inside goes quiet, replaced by a pounding heartbeat and the suffocating realization that something is terribly wrong. That moment came for Kevin Bardsley just after 8 a.m. on the cool August morning of August 20th, 2004, at Q Brant Lake in Utah's Uinta Mountains. Kevin had been walking quickly back toward camp, calling his son's name. At first, he was patient. He thought Garrett might be dragging his feet, or perhaps had paused to tie his shoe. He retraced the steps, calling louder, his voice echoing through the alpine forest. Still no reply. The sound of his own voice was eerie against the stillness, a father calling, the forest silent in response. Kevin backtracked to where the two had separated on the trail. He stood still, scanning the trees. He listened for the crunch of gravel, the swish of fabric, even the light panting of a boy hustling to catch up. But there was nothing, only wind moving through the pine needles and the distant trickle of water. The boy was gone. At first, Kevin thought Garrett must have taken a wrong fork. Maybe he had veered onto one of the many side trails carved by other hikers and animals. The Uintas are notorious for this. The ground is crisscrossed with deer paths and faint tracks that, to an adult, are easy to dismiss. But to a child, they can look deceptively like the real thing. Kevin ran down one trail, then another, calling his son's name. Still nothing. Minutes bled into nearly half an hour. His voice was growing hoarse. The forest, once peaceful, now felt endless, swallowing sound and presence alike. Panic began to settle in his chest like lead. This was no longer a simple mistake. Kevin turned back toward camp, his footsteps pounding. The Boy Scouts would need the help. Together, they could spread out, search the area, and find Garrett quickly. He refused to let his mind wander to the darker possibilities. But already, a faint horror was scratching at the edges of his thoughts. When he arrived back at camp, his face told the story before his words did. The boys gathered around cooking gear in tents, watched as Kevin strode in, breathless. "Garrett didn't come back," he said, the words clipped sharp. At first, the adults thought it was a mix-up. Maybe Garrett had beaten his father to camp and was sitting quietly, unnoticed. The group scattered, checking tents, scanning the lakeshore, calling his name. Each moment they expected Garrett's face to appear, sheepish but safe. Each moment he did not. The troop leaders tried to calm Kevin. "Kids wander, we'll find him." But already, their voices carried a tension beneath the surface. The fathers and leaders knew this wilderness was not forgiving. One wrong step off the trail could mean being swallowed in a maze of forest, where every tree looks like the last. The scouts spread out in small groups, combing the area near camp. They checked the trail leading back to the lake, then circled outward. Kevin retraced the fishing spot, shouting until his throat ached. But Garrett had not gone back to the lake. Time was slipping away. By mid-morning, with no sign of Garrett, the decision was made. They needed more help. One of the adults hurried to get cell service. A trek down the trail, toward an area where a signal might be picked up. A call was placed to the Summit County Sheriff's Office. A missing child in the wilderness. By noon, the Bardsleys' world had completely shifted. What had started as a simple fishing trip had become a full-blown emergency. Garrett had been gone for hours. No food, no extra clothing, no map or compass. Just a boy in sneakers, a red shirt, and a pair of shorts lost in the wild. The first wave of panic is never just about the missing. It is about the imagination. Kevin and the other adults pictured the worst. Garrett stumbling, twisting his ankle, crying out in pain with no one around to hear. Garrett wandering deeper into the forest, each step pulling him farther from safety. Garrett calling for help while his voice was swallowed by the mountains. The clock ticked louder in everyone's mind. Every hour mattered. Every hour Garrett remained unfound made the situation more dire. Search and rescue teams were dispatched that afternoon. Volunteers, deputies, and Forest Service officials began arriving. Helicopters were requested. Bloodhounds were brought in to try to track Garrett's scent. The once quiet campsite was transformed into the staging ground of a massive operation. Radios crackled, maps were spread out, teams were assigned grid sections. The scouts watched with wide eyes, their young faces pale with fear. For many of them, this was their first brush with the cruel truth of wilderness. Nature doesn't play favorites. As evening began to fall, Kevin's panic transformed into something deeper, a gnawing dread. The Uintas were beautiful by day, but the nights were brutal. Temperatures plunged. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Even the stars above, dazzling against the black sky, felt like cold spectators to a growing tragedy. Somewhere out there was a son, a 12-year-old boy, alone, possibly injured, the forest closing around him. The first day was always crucial. Rescuers knew that if Garrett was to be found quickly, it had to be now, before darkness fell. But as the sun slipped behind the jagged ridges, their voices grew hoarse, their flashlights weak against the vastness of the trees. They searched ravines, loch shores, meadows, all in vain. There was no sign of Garrett Bardsley. And with that realization, the true weight of the situation pressed down on everyone. This was no simple misdirection, no ordinary child wandering a few hundred yards too far. Garrett had vanished into the wilderness, and night had arrived. For Kevin, standing in the dark, clutching a flashlight and staring into the endless trees, the panic was no longer a passing wave. It was permanent. The first panic had become the beginning of a nightmare. By dawn on August 21st, 2004, Q Brant Lake was no longer a quiet wilderness outpost. What had been a Boy Scout campsite was now the center of a coordinated search and rescue mission, buzzing with activity, urgency, and a kind of desperation that could be felt in the cold mountain air. The night had been brutal. Searchers with flashlights had scoured the nearby trails, their beams slicing across tree trunks and boulders, voices calling Garrett's name into the endless dark. But no voice had answered back. No movement in the underbrush. No sign of a boy huddled beneath a pine tree waiting for rescue. Kevin Bardsley had not slept. He had paced the perimeter, calling out until his voice gave out, collapsing in exhaustion only when deputies insisted he rest. But rest never came. His eyes remained fixed on the black line of trees, willing his son to step out, smiling, apologizing for scaring everyone. Morning light did not bring comfort. It brought the grim efficiency of a search effort, expanding by the hour. By sunrise, Summit County Sheriff's deputies had established a command post. Search and rescue teams poured in volunteers, train trackers, Forest Service officials. Radios crackled with assignments. Helicopters from the Utah Department of Public Safety began sweeping the ridgelines and valleys, their thundering blades announcing to everyone below that this was no ordinary missing person call. Within hours, more than 150 people had joined the search. By the end of the weekend, that number would swell to nearly 1,000. It was one of the largest search operations Utah had ever seen. Search dogs were brought in, noses pressed to the ground, handlers urging them along the trails. They were given items of Garrett's clothing, hoping to catch his scent. For a brief moment, hope surged. The dogs picked up faint traces near the trail, where Garrett had last been seen. But then, just as suddenly, the scent vanished. The dogs circled, confused. The trail was gone. It was as though Garrett had stepped off the earth. The Uintas are unforgiving ground for searchers. The terrain is rugged, carved by glaciers, with steep ridges, boggy meadows, and thick stand of pine and aspen. Trails twist and vanish. Game paths crisscross with human ones. A person can walk 10 steps off the trail and disappear into a tangle of undergrowth where visibility shrinks to nothing. Search teams move methodically. Grid by grid, they combed the area around Q Brant Lake. They checked ravines, overturned logs, boulder fields. They scanned the waterlines of nearby lakes, fearing Garrett might have slipped and fallen into one of the icy depths. Helicopters hovered above, crew members using thermal imaging to search for heat signatures. But the screen showed nothing, just a vast, cold outlines of wilderness. Every hour that passed without discovery was an hour too long. The Boy Scouts who had camped with Garrett were questioned gently, asked to recall everything they could. Had Garrett said anything unusual that morning? Had anyone seen which path he took? But the answers were vague. He had been right behind his father, walking back toward camp. And then suddenly, he wasn't. For investigators, this was maddening. Children don't simply vanish on flat, visible trails. Unless he had left the trail, or something else had happened, rumors began to ripple among volunteers and locals. Could Garrett have been taken by an animal? A mountain lion? But experts quickly pushed back. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. Could he have fallen into water? But extensive dives into the lakes revealed nothing. The more they searched, the less sense it made. By the second day, national attention had begun to stir. Local news stations arrived, setting up cameras near the command post. Reporters interviewed volunteers, families, and officials. The Bardsleys, private, church-going people, suddenly found themselves in front of microphones, pleading for help, for prayers, for their boy to come home. Kevin's voice trembled as he described his son. He's strong, he's smart, he knows how to camp. He should be able to survive out here. The words were spoken with conviction, but behind his eyes was a shadow of doubt every parent dreads. Linda, Garrett's mother, who had not been on the trip, arrived at the site, the sight of her clutching her husband's arm, scanning the forest with wide, terrified eyes, broke even hardened searchers. This was not just a missing person case. This was a family being torn apart in real time. The search expanded farther outward. Teams checked Q Brant Lake's basin, then radiated into surrounding ridgelines, climbing into higher elevations where Garrett might have wandered. Some volunteers theorized that Garrett, realizing he had lost the trail, may have followed water downhill, a common instinct in survival scenarios. Teams searched stream beds and ravines. Others speculated he may have tried to circle back to camp, becoming hopelessly turned around in the maze of trees. But each theory ended the same way, with no Garrett, no footprints, no clothing, no trace. It was as if the wilderness had swallowed him whole. And then came the weather. By the third day, clouds rolled in, heavy with rain. Showers swept the mountains, turning trails into slick mud, erasing any faint tracks that might have been there. The temperature plummeted at night, dipping into the 30s. Searchers shivered in jackets and thermal gear. Garrett, if still alive, had none of that, just shorts, sneakers, and a thin shirt. The urgency became palpable. Rescuers pushed harder, voices raw from shouting, legs aching from miles of steep terrain. Volunteers wept openly at night, praying for a miracle. But the storm also meant something worse. Time was running out. A child exposed to those elements, without shelter, without supplies, could not last long. By midweek, the scale of the search was staggering. Entire lines of volunteers swept the woods shoulder to shoulder, calling Garrett's name. Helicopters flew constant rotations. Horses were brought in to cover more ground. Still, nothing. Every day ended the same. Exhausted rescuers trudging back to camp, heads low, their silence saying more than words could. Every night, Kevin stared into darkness, unwilling to stop listening for his son's voice. Somewhere deep inside, he still believed Garrett would come walking out of the trees, tired, hungry, but alive. That hope, thin as it was, kept him going. But among the search leaders, another truth was setting in. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was becoming a recovery. In the span of a few days, the disappearance of one 12-year-old boy had drawn hundreds of people into the unforgiving backcountry of Utah. The air was thick with desperation, prayers, and questions that no one could answer. How does a boy vanish on a short, simple trail right behind his father? And why, with every resource thrown at the search, was there still nothing? The search had expanded, but so had the mystery. By the 6th day of searching, the Uinta Mountains felt less like a wilderness and more like a riddle carved in stone and pine, a cruel puzzle that mocked every effort to solve it. Hundreds of boots had stamped down grass, overturned rocks, scoured ravines. Helicopters had traced the same ridgelines again and again, their shadows sweeping across lakes like dark omens. Dogs had been run until their paws were raw. Still, the forest gave nothing back. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single sign that a 12-year-old boy had ever passed through. This was the part that gnawed at everyone. In most search and rescue cases, something emerges: a drop candy wrapper, a shoe print in the mud, a bent blade of grass. But with Garrett, it was as if the earth itself had closed over him. Search leaders, men and women who had spent decades combing Utah's mountains for the lost and the missing, were baffled. One official was quoted saying, "Usually we get some indication within a day or two. With Garrett, it's nothing. It's like he vanished into thin air." Kevin and Linda Bardsley lived every parent's worst nightmare in those days. Kevin, who had last seen Garrett walking the trail, replayed that moment in his head endlessly. The red shirt, the easy stride, the belief that his son was right behind him. He blamed himself, though others reminded him that in wilderness, accidents can unfold in seconds. Linda drifted between hope and despair. She clutched the sweatshirt of Garrett's that rescuers had used for the scent dogs, pressing it to her face as if it could anchor him back to her. She told reporters, her voice breaking, "He's strong. He knows how to camp. He knows what to do. He's my little boy. I just want him home." But hope was being tested every hour that passed. Rescuers continued pushing outward. They searched meadows and bogs. They checked caves, overhangs, even hollow tree trunks where a desperate child might have crawled for shelter. Divers once again probed the dark waters of nearby lakes, their bubbles rising to the surface like questions with no answers. They found nothing. Helicopter crews, equipped with thermal imaging, made low passes over the area at night, hoping to pick up the faint heat signature of a huddled body. But the screens glowed empty, no sign of life hidden among the trees. The dogs, too, grew restless. After their initial faint hit, they had nothing else to follow. Handlers watched as their animals circled aimlessly, noses failing to catch the scent of boys who should have been just yards away. It was like chasing a ghost. And then came the weight of silence. For volunteers, The silence was the hardest part. They had come in waves. Parents, neighbors, complete strangers who had read Garrett's story in the paper and felt compelled to help. They combed miles of wilderness. Their calls of Garrett, Garrett, echoing back without reply. At night, when they returned to the base camp, the silence settled in again, a suffocating reminder that the boy was still gone. Some wept quietly. Others grew angry, frustrated at the futility. How could hundreds of people, armed with maps, radios, and helicopters, not find one child? The question hung heavy in the mountain air. Theories began to swirl. Some searchers speculated Garrett might have fallen into a hidden crevice or sinkhole, swallowed by the land itself. Others suggested he had wandered far beyond the immediate radius, walking in circles until he was miles away. A few even whispered darker thoughts, that perhaps someone had taken him. Authorities addressed that quickly. There was no evidence of abduction, no signs of another person on the trail, no vehicles nearby, and Garrett's disappearance had been so fast, so silent, it seemed almost impossible for a stranger to have orchestrated it. Still, the lack of evidence left room for doubt. By the 10th day, exhaustion set in. The search had been relentless, but the terrain was punishing. Volunteers staggered back to camp with blistered feet, faces burned from sun and wind, clothes soaked from sudden mountain storms. Many had to return to work, to families, to lives that felt impossibly distant from the mountain where Garrett remained missing. The number of active searchers began to shrink. For the Bardsleys, the shrinking search felt like a betrayal, even if they knew it was inevitable. Kevin stood before cameras, his face lined with grief, pleading for the effort to continue. Please don't stop looking. My son is out there. He needs us. But rescuers knew a hard truth. After more than a week in cold mountain nights, with no food or gear, the odds of survival were slim. And yet, hope is not rational. Hope is not mathematical. Hope is a parent who cannot imagine life without their child. Kevin and Linda clung to that hope. Even as the wilderness remained mute, the forest, vast and ancient, kept its secrets. Each passing day seemed to mock the searchers' efforts, as though the mountains themselves had chosen to hide Garrett away. By the end of the second week, officials announced they were scaling back the search. Helicopters would no longer fly constant rotations. Fewer ground teams would be deployed. The mission was shifting from rescue to recovery. The words landed like a death knell. For Kevin, the man who had walked ahead on the trail, it was unbearable. He replayed every second, every choice. If only he had slowed down. If only he had turned back sooner. If only... But there was no undoing it. The Bardsleys refused to give up. Even as official resources dwindled, Kevin organized independent searches. He called on friends, church members, anyone willing to hike the unforgiving terrain. Weekend after weekend, they came, retracing the same ground, hoping the forest would finally yield what had taken. It never did. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Snow began to fall in the Uintas, covering the trails, erasing all chance of finding new clues until spring. The search had ended. The mystery had only deepened. Garrett Bardsley, a boy of 12, had walked behind his father on a clear morning in August, and then he was gone. No trace, no sign, no answer. The forest had given nothing back. When the helicopters left and the search parties thinned to only a handful of volunteers, the mountains grew quiet again. The once bustling command post was packed up, maps folded away, radios stored, tents dismantled. The search for Garrett had not ended with an answer. It had ended with silence. And into that silence crept the theories. It is a human impulse. When faced with mystery too unbearable to accept, the mind begins to construct explanations. Some are logical. Some are far-fetched. Some are born of fear. Others are born of denial. For Garrett's disappearance, theories sprang up like weeds in the cracks of grief. None of them brought comfort. The most widely accepted explanation was also the most heartbreaking, that Garrett had simply wandered off the trail, become disoriented, and pushed farther into the wilderness than rescuers ever reached. Search leaders knew how easily it could happen. A child following a faint animal path, mistaking it for the main trail. A wrong turn, unnoticed in the brief seconds between father and son. Once off track, panic sets in. Children, experts say, often don't stay put as survival training teaches. They move, sometimes quickly, sometimes in circles, often deeper into danger. If this theory was true, Garrett may have walked until exhaustion overcame him. He may have curled beneath a tree, waiting for a rescue that never arrived. But here was a sticking point. After one of the largest search efforts in Utah history, covering dozens of square miles with aerial sweeps, thermal imaging, dogs, and divers, not a single sign was ever found. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a bone, not even years later when snow melted and spring revealed what winter had covered. For many, that absence made the lost boy theory feel incomplete. Others suggested Garrett had slipped into one of the region's cold, clear lakes. Drowning victims can remain hidden beneath the surface, snagged on underwater debris, invisible to divers. This theory, too, had merit. Garrett had been fishing that morning. Lakes dotted the terrain around Q Brant. If he had strayed near one while trying to find camp, perhaps he had fallen in. Yet multiple dives had been conducted during the first days of the search. Experienced divers scoured the waters, probing depths, checking likely spots. Nothing. Years passed, and hikers still fished those same lakes. None ever reported the discovery of remains or clothing. The water, like the forest, gave nothing back. Whispers spread of mountain lions, black bears, coyotes. Could one have taken Garrett so quickly, so silently? Wildlife experts were quick to push back. Mountain lions typically drag prey, leaving signs of struggle, blood, torn fabric, claw marks. Bears, too, are rarely so clean in their violence. Coyotes, opportunistic, are scavengers more than hunters of boys. Searchers have found no evidence of attack, not a drop of blood, not a shred of clothing. The idea of a wild animal was frightening but improbable. And then came the darker shadows, the suggestion that someone had taken Garrett. The Uintas are remote but not empty. Campers, hikers, hunters all move through those woods. Could a stranger have crossed paths with Garrett in that small window of time? On the surface, it seemed impossible. Kevin had been only steps ahead. The camp was only a short distance away. No vehicles had been spotted. No reports of suspicious figures emerged. And there had been no signs of a struggle. But abductions leave behind few clues when executed swiftly. The mere possibility was enough to ignite debate in the community and online forums years later. For some, it was the only explanation that made sense. A boy doesn't vanish without a trace unless someone helps him disappear. Still, law enforcement found no evidence pointing to abduction. No witnesses. No suspects. Nothing to chase. And when the rational fails, people turn to the irrational. Even in a modern world, the wilderness has a way of inviting old fears and ancient stories. Some whisper about spirits of the mountains, curses, or the land claiming the boy. Others evoke the phenomenon known as the missing 411, cases of people vanishing under bizarre, unexplainable circumstances in national parks and forests. Theories of portals, of strange disappearances without tracks, a phenomena beyond comprehension. For Garrett's grieving family, such talk was salt in the wound. For Kevin, a man of faith, these stories distracted from the reality. His boy had been alive, real, flesh and blood, and now he was gone. Garrett's absence was tragedy enough without the weight of folklore piled on top. For the Bardsleys, theories offered no comfort. Each was a knife. If Garrett was lost, it meant he had suffered alone, calling for help that never came. If he drowned, it meant his final moments were terror and cold. If an animal had taken him, it meant violence no parent could bear to imagine. If a stranger abducted him, it meant betrayal of the very safety of the mountains they loved. And if none of these were true, it meant the mystery was deeper, stranger, and crueler than anyone wanted to admit. Theories did not heal. Theories did not bring closure. They only built walls of what if around the family's grief. Kevin and Linda faced the cameras as weeks turned into months. Their community rallied, but the looks of pity cut as deep as the looks of hope. People asked questions. People speculated. People offered their own theories. But at night, when the crowds were gone, when only the whispering pines remained outside their window, there were no theories, only the unbearable absence of their son. No theory could explain why the wilderness remained silent. Why, despite all the effort, all the searching, all the prayers, Garrett had not been found. Why the forest had given nothing back. Stories like Garrett's can fade into silence unless we keep them alive. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. So together, we can remember the lost and never stop asking questions. The first days of the search had been defined by urgency. The second week was defined by something far darker, the slow bleed of hope. The Bardsley family, once held together by the adrenaline of maybe today, began to face an unthinkable truth. The wilderness was swallowing their boy, and each hour that passed without a trace only made its grip tighter. By this point, the numbers alone were staggering. More than 1,500 trained volunteers and professional rescuers had cycled through the Uinta Mountains. The search covered an estimated 50 square miles of punishing terrain, ridgelines, lockshores, talus fields, dense timber, and steep ravines. Helicopters with infrared scanning equipment swept the valleys. Search dogs worked tirelessly, some brought in from other states. Horses were used to cover wider trails, while teams with ropes rappelled into canyons. And yet, nothing. Not a shred of clothing. Not a footprint. Not a fishing pole. Not a hint of a trail where a 12-year-old boy might have walked. For search organizers, this wasn't just unusual. It was almost impossible. Typically, in wilderness rescues, even when someone has perished, there are signs, broken branches, discarded food wrappers, footprints pressed into mud, an article of clothing snagged on a bush. But Garrett had seemingly disintegrated into the mountain air. Kevin Bardsley, Garrett's father, was increasingly haunted by a single crushing thought. I was right there. He had walked with his son to the lake. They had spoken, fished together, laughed even. Then Garrett had started back to camp alone, barely a couple hundred yards of trail, and somehow vanished. Every time Kevin replayed those minutes in his head, he looked for something. A sound he had missed, a movement in the trees, a warning he hadn't heard. But there was only silence. That silence had followed him from that day, embedding itself like a splinter under the skin. Kevin was also dealing with another torment, the unspoken judgment of others. Some whispers suggested he should never have let Garrett walk alone, even for such a short distance. Others quietly wondered whether foul play had been involved, even pointing suspicion in directions no grieving parent should ever have to face. Law enforcement never named Kevin or the family as suspects, but rumors spread like wildfire in small mountain towns, especially when a case seemed so inexplicable. For Kevin, the guilt and grief were unbearable. He began throwing himself into the search with a vengeance, refusing rest, scouring areas already checked, insisting Garrett had to be somewhere nearby. His exhaustion bordered on collapse, but he would not stop. To him, the thought of leaving without his boy was worse than death. The media storm. By week 2, the media had fully descended on the Uinta Mountains. News crews filmed helicopters thundering overhead, volunteers trudging through rain-soaked meadows, an emotional strain etched into the faces of Garrett's family. Headlines across Utah carried phrases like, Boy Scout still missing in high Uintas. Search effort one of largest in state history. Family pleads for help as days stretch on. National outlets picked up the story, amplifying the mystery. This wasn't just a case of a lost hiker. This was a child, a Boy Scout no less, trained in survival basics, with father only a stone's throw away. How could someone vanish in such a small window of space and time, leaving nothing behind? The coverage ignited speculation. Commentators argued theories. Did Garrett stumble and fall into a hidden crevasse or waterway? Was he attacked by an animal? Did someone else encounter him on that trail? A stranger, a predator? Theories flourished in online forums, where armchair detectives picked apart the few known details. But one truth rang louder than the noise. No one, not even the experts in the field, could explain how Garrett had seemingly ceased to exist. The searchers themselves, many of them seasoned rescue veterans, were shaken. Men and women who had pulled survivors from avalanches, who had located hunters' days lost in blizzards, now found themselves baffled by the absence of even a clue. One search leader admitted in frustration, "I've been doing this for decades. When someone goes missing, we find something. A jacket, a footprint, a scent for the dogs to pick up. With Garrett, nothing. It's like he evaporated. Volunteers began to question themselves. Had they missed an area? Walked right past him? Were they looking in the wrong direction entirely? Each night, exhausted and defeated, they returned to base camp with more questions than answers. The atmosphere at camp grew heavier. In the beginning, it had buzz with determination. By the second week, it was hushed, almost funereal. Coffee mugs went cold in people's hands. Voices were muted. Everyone felt the same dread. The longer this went on, the less chance there was that Garrett would be found alive. Nature itself seemed to conspire against them. The Uintas were alive with challenges. Sudden storms that dropped cold rain. Thick fog that rolled across ridges and swallowed visibility. Temperatures that swung brutally from hot to freezing. The underbrush was thick, swallowing small bodies like quicksand. The boulder fields were vast and chaotic, offering endless cracks and hollows where someone might slip and vanish from sight. Streams rushed cold and fast with snowmelt, dangerous even for adults. It was easy to imagine how a child might stumble, panic, and make a fatal mistake. But again, the question remained, where was the evidence? Search dogs sometimes gave faint indications, a whiff of the scent, a moment of interest, but every time the lead went cold. Helicopters found nothing. Thermal imaging was useless against the heavy tree canopy. The mountain was winning, and it wasn't giving Garrett back. For Kevin and the rest of the Bardsleys, the hardest part was not the idea of Garrett's death, though that was unbearable. The hardest part was the not knowing. Had Garrett become lost and wandered miles away, still alive somewhere, waiting to be found? Had he suffered an accident within shouting distance of camp, his body hidden in some fold of terrain no one had thought to check? Or had something darker happened? Something human, in the brief space between lake and camp? Each possibility was tormenting, and each day without an answer made the family's grief more suffocating. By the end of the second week, the official line of hope was already thinning. Search leaders admitted, quietly at first, that survival chances were nearly zero. The only thing that could explain the lack of evidence was that Garrett was gone, buried, drowned, hidden, or taken. But Kevin would not let go. Not yet. His boy was out there. And if the mountain thought it could take him without a fight, it had underestimated the will of a father who would tear through granite with his bare hands before giving up. And so the search pressed on, exhausted, defeated, but not yet finished. Still, the air around Q Brant Lake had shifted. What had begun as a rescue mission was evolving into something else entirely, a grim hunt for answers in a wilderness that gave none. The forest had closed in, and Garrett remained swallowed in its silence. By the time the search crossed into its third week, the Uinta Mountains felt different, not just the Bardsleys, but to everyone who had spent long, punishing days scouring the forests and ridges for Garrett. The urgency of those first frantic days had given way to something slower, heavier, more suffocating. It was in the silence that you could feel it most. Where once the meadows buzzed with volunteers' voices calling Garrett's name, now there was less shouting, less energy. Searchers no longer sprinted into the trees at first light. They moved more slowly, their steps measured, their eyes downcast. Everyone knew what was happening, but few had the heart to say it out loud. Search and rescue leaders finally addressed what had hung unspoken in the air. The chances of finding Garrett alive were nearly gone. They had already conducted one of the largest search efforts in Utah history. Teams had logged thousands of man-hours. Every ravine, every ridgeline, every stream had been combed and then combed again. But Garrett had left behind no trace. When the lead coordinator stood before cameras and family to announce that the search would be scaled back, his words landed like stones. At this point, we have exhausted every lead and covered every feasible area of terrain. We will continue limited efforts, but the full-scale rescue operation is being suspended. To the world, it was bureaucratic, a hard decision made from experience. But to Kevin and the Bardsleys, it was a death sentence written in polite language. Scaling back meant something unthinkable. The world was moving on while Garrett remained in the forest. Kevin refused to accept it. How could he? He had been within shouting distance of his son when he disappeared. The idea that Garrett could vanish so close and remain unfound felt like mockery. He pushed himself to keep searching. Even as the official efforts waned, Kevin trekked back into mountains again and again. He retraced trails, revisited ravines, crawled over talus fields until his hands bled. Each day, he told himself, maybe today, maybe this is the day I bring him home. His wife and other children faced a different kind of torment, the daily waiting. They watched the man of the family come and go, half ghost himself, consumed by guilt and determination. The Bardsleys' home became a place where the air was heavy, where normal life felt offensive in its ordinariness. How could anyone laugh, eat, or watch TV when Garrett was still out there in the cold? For Kevin, the guilt never left. His last words to his son, before Garrett started back down the trail, replayed endlessly. He wondered if Garrett looked back, if there had been a hesitation, if he had missed some subtle signal in his boy's body language that morning. The thought that he might have prevented all of this ate at him like acid. Volunteers began packing up, heading back to their own homes, their own lives. Some wept openly when they said goodbye to the family. Others simply lowered their heads, ashamed they had failed. One rescuer, a father himself, said quietly to Kevin, "We did everything we could. If there was a way to find him, we would have." But such words offered no comfort. For Kevin, everything was not enough. As the lines of cars rolled away from a mountain base camp, the once bustling hub of activity felt eerily quiet. The helicopters were grounded. The dogs were sent home. The official maps, once covered in colored pins and notes, were rolled up and filed away. What remained was only the family's grief in the vast, silent wilderness, a wilderness that seemed indifferent to human suffering. With the official search ending, the narrative began to shift. Without new updates, speculation flourished. Some were convinced Garrett had become hopelessly lost and wandered miles from where anyone thought to look. Others believed he had fallen into a body of water or a hidden crack in the earth, swallowed by nature's merciless design. But there were darker whispers, too. Some asked, was there foul play? Could someone else in the wilderness have crossed paths with Garrett that morning? Theories of an unknown predator, a stranger, or even suspicion directed at his own family surfaced in hushed conversations and online forums. Law enforcement maintained there was no evidence of abduction or crime. Yet the absence of evidence was exactly what fueled imaginations. People wanted an answer, any answer, to explain what seemed impossible. In the beginning, cameras had swarmed the story. They captured the hopeful faces of volunteers, the tears of Garrett's mother, the determination of Kevin trudging through alpine meadows. But as days turned into weeks, the cameras began to leave. Reporters packed their gear and drove away. Headlines dwindled. Other stories filled the airwaves: elections, wars, celebrity scandals. The tragedy of a boy lost in the wilderness was no longer fresh. And the Bardsleys, still trapped in the nightmare, were left with a painful realization. The world had moved on. Kevin continued to search. He walked those mountains with the weight of a man who had lost more than his son. He had lost his own certainty about the world. What kind of place allows a child to vanish without a trace? What kind of world leaves a father standing on a trail, screaming his boy's name into silence, and gets no answer back? Some nights, Kevin slept on the mountain, refusing to leave, hoping Garrett might somehow return. He dreamed of footsteps crunching outside his tent, only to wake and find nothing. He listened for the sound of his son's voice carried on the wind, but heard only the groan of trees in the dark. The mountain had swallowed Garrett whole, and it seemed intent on keeping it secret. The Bardsleys' pain mirrored a cruel reality. When a search transitions from rescue to recovery, everything changes. The language grows colder. The urgency softens. The very people who had once sprinted into the forest with a determination to save a life now spoke instead of locating remains. For a parent, such a shift was unbearable. To think of Garrett as a body rather than a boy was impossible. And yet, that was what time demanded. The wilderness had transformed from a place of beauty into a vast tomb, one where no gravestone marked the loss, no flowers could be placed, no closure could be found. By the close of the third week, the search was no longer truly a search. It was ritual, an act of going through motions in the faintest hope of a miracle. Kevin clung to that ember of hope, refusing to let it go cold. But deep down, everyone knew. The rescuers knew. The family knew. The forest knew. Hope had turned to ash. And in that ash lay only grief, unanswered questions, and a silence that would echo through Bardsley's lives for decades. Garrett was gone, whether he lay somewhere in those mountains, or whether something else had taken him far away. No one could say. What was certain was that the world would never again be the same for those who loved him, and the mountain, vast and indifferent, held its secret tight. When the last official rescuer left the Uintas, the mountain returned to itself. The hum of helicopters, the barking of dogs, the footsteps of hundreds of searchers, all faded. What remained was only the wind fretting through pines, the ripple of lakes under gray skies, and a silence so complete it felt unnatural. But for the Bardsleys, that silence was unbearable. It was the sound of their child being lost to the world, a life frozen in time. Garrett Bardsley was 12 years old when he vanished. Not a teenager yet, not still a little boy, but somewhere in between, a boy who laughed with his dad at the water's edge, who knew his knots and survival basics, who carried himself with the energy of someone eager to grow into a scout and a young man. And then, nothing. The disappearance froze Garrett in that moment. His classmates grew taller, their voices changed, their lives moved forward. But Garrett remained the boy with the fishing pole, forever 12, forever vanishing on a misty morning in the Uintas. For his family, that timelessness was its own cruelty. Birthdays passed. Empty chairs sat at holiday dinners. Photographs remained unchanging. The house carried an absence as sharp as presence. Kevin carried the heaviest weight. No matter how many times law enforcement assured him it wasn't his fault, the loop replayed endlessly in his mind. I was right there. I could have done something. I should have been faster. Grief changed him. Friends saw in his posture, in the lines on his face. He had become a man half dwelling in the wilderness where his boy had disappeared. He would return to those mountains again and again, sometimes with volunteers, sometimes alone. He would walk the trails, retrace the path between lake and camp, search the boulder fields, call his son's name into the void. Every trip ended the same way. Silence. Garrett's mother carried her grief differently. She bore it quietly, protecting the rest of her children, shielding them from the full weight of tragedy. But in the quiet moments, the weight returned. What mother could stop herself from wondering where her boy lay? Was he cold? Was he hurt? Did he call out for her in those last moments, and did she fail to hear? For the siblings, the disappearance became a shadow cast across their entire upbringing. They grew older under the weight of a brother forever missing, a family forever incomplete. Utah never forgot Garrett. In the years after his disappearance, the case remained a reference point in discussions of wilderness safety, of the fragility of life in the outdoors, of the way mountains could take without mercy. Fundraisers were held. Memorial services gathered people who had searched and prayed. His name became entwined with the Uintas themselves. Not a ghost story, but a reminder. Every hiker, every scout, every parent who stepped into that wilderness after 2004 carried Garrett's memory with them, whether they realized it or not. His absence became part of the landscape, just as real as the jagged peaks and alpine lakes. Some believed Garrett had simply become disoriented, wandered far, and succumbed to exposure before anyone could find him. In such vast terrain, even the largest search efforts can miss a single child, especially when steep canyons and tangled brush hide so much. Others believe he had fallen into a ravine under talus, into a hidden pocket of wilderness that made his small body invisible. The Uintas are riddled with such traps. A wrong step could mean a disappearance that leaves no trace. And there were always those who whispered of darker possibilities. An abduction, a crime committed in the briefest of windows. Though law enforcement never found evidence to support foul play, the sheer lack of evidence left space for endless speculation. To this day, no one can say what happened with certainty. And that uncertainty is the cruelest punishment of all. Q Brant Lake still looks the same. The water sparkles in the sunlight, alpine meadows ripple with wildflowers, and scouts still trek those trails every summer. But to those who know Garrett's story, the beauty is edged with menace, because the mountain has not given him back. There is no grave, No marked place to mourn, just a stretch of wilderness that swallows sound and memory alike. The haunting silence lingers. Kevin Bardsley refused to let his son's story be reduced to a headline or a mystery whispered in online forums. In the years after Garrett vanished, he became an advocate for wilderness safety, sharing the lessons of that day to try to save others from similar tragedy. But nothing filled the void. Nothing eased the guilt. Nothing brought Garrett home. Kevin himself would later die in a tragic accident, also in the Utah wilderness, leaving behind a family twice scarred by the mountains. For those who knew him, it felt like the final cruelty of a landscape that had already taken too much. To this day, Garrett Bardsley's disappearance remains one of Utah's most haunting unsolved mysteries. No trace of his body has ever been found. No clothing, no shoes, no fishing pole. No answers, only echoes. It is the kind of case that gnaws at the mind because it breaks the rules of logic. Children do not simply disappear a few hundred yards from their fathers in broad daylight, with searchers scouring every inch for weeks. And yet, that is exactly what happened. For the Bardsleys, the grief is endless because the story is unfinished. For the world, it is a reminder of how fragile we are against nature's indifference. In the end, Garrett's story is not just about a boy lost in the Uintas. It is about what it means to live without answers, to love someone who is missing, to carry a grief that never resolves. The mountains stand unchanged. The lake ripples under the same sky. Hikers still pass along the trails, unaware that they walk over ground where hundreds once searched in vain. And in that silence, Garrett's absence lingers, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are not the ones solved in crime labs or courtrooms, but the ones written into the earth itself. The haunting silence of the Uintas holds him still, and perhaps it always will. Garrett's disappearance remains one of Utah's most heartbreaking wilderness mysteries. A boy who walked only a short distance and was never seen again. If you want to keep these stories alive, to give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves, make sure you subscribe and join us as we uncover the cases the world refuses to forget.